Okay, I'll be talking a bit about the climate change effects on Australian fish species. As we all know, climate is rapidly changing, and our oceans are warming at faster rates than we've seen historically. If you look across the globe, there are certain hotspots where warming is occurring at much faster rates than the global average. And two of those hotspots are actually located in Australia. So one at the southwestern coast and one at the southeastern coast. Ocean warming has gained a lot of interest from researchers and managers, but we know much less about the effect of ocean acidification, which occurs at the same time as ocean warming. So as we keep increasing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, the ocean absorbs about a third to a quarter of that CO2, leading to the process of ocean acidification. So in this graph we see increases in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and at the same time increasing CO2 concentrations in the ocean, leading to a decrease in the pH level, the acidity level of the oceans. Because there are a lot of organisms in the oceans that build skeletons made of calcium carbonate, those were the first organisms that were actually studied in terms of negative effects of ocean acidification. So think of oysters, corals, coral reefs, foraminifera, and so on. We know almost nothing about the ocean acidification effects on fishes, so vertebrates, which don't have skeletons of calcium carbonate, but recent research has shown that also these species might be affected. Okay, so if we bring it back to Australia, temperate Australia, Adelaide, what do we really know about effects of warming and ocean acidification on our marine ecosystem and fishes? Well, there's barely any empirical data available, and it's of course very difficult to perform experiments in the future. So as a first step, what we did is performed a global meta-analysis, and we collected all the existing data on experiments and natural laboratories and looked at effect sizes of these two stressors. We specifically looked at response variables that are relevant for food webs, and we looked at latitudinal effects, effects of specific ecosystems, and also functional groups. This is an overview of what we found, and in most cases there wasn't much of an effect of latitude or ecosystem, meaning that a lot of species from various ecosystems across the globe are very likely to show similar responses to climate change and ocean acidification. So that includes our South Australian fish species and ecosystems. Okay, so what this is, so this is the primary level here, primary production. Blue is the effect of ocean acidification alone. Orange is the effect of warming, and red is the combined effect, because these two stressors are co-occurring at the same time. So I'm just focus mostly on the combined effect here. So what we found, combining all of these studies, is we saw that primary production generally increases, largely due to temperature. There was a latitudinal effect there, whereas while we didn't see much effect in the tropics, in the temperate areas, such as South Australia, we clearly saw an actual increase of primary production. So that's the basis of the food web, so that could have important consequences for higher trophic levels. We also saw that due to increased metabolic demands, herbivores, which consume that primary production, actually showed higher consumption rates. They simply need to burn more energy to sustain their growth. However, we saw that the productivity, so the biomass increase, decreased in those herbivores. So this then again has a consequence for the next trophic level, where again you see higher energetic demand, and as a result of less food, it's most likely that carnivores will show lower production. And these carnivores are typically the species we depend on from a point of fisheries resources, so recreational fisheries and commercial fisheries. We also saw big changes in the phytoplankton, community shifts towards smaller phytoplankton, which are less valuable as food sources for zooplankton, which again supports the whole oceanic food web. We also found large changes due to ocean acidification and warming in terms of community structuring, so novel community structures are likely to appear, and overall species diversity shows a decrease due to ocean acidification, largely because animals that build calcium carbonate skeletons slowly disappear. Of course, a lot of this will have consequences for fisheries production, how resilient our ecosystems are to these stressors, but also to local stressors and other human sources of pollution. As you saw from that graph, we really know very little about how mesopredators or predators are affected, and those are the species we typically fish on, which are important for fisheries. So we performed an experiment on Port Jackson shark, a local species, which is a mesopredator. And what we found is, according to our prediction from our meta-analysis, if you increase temperature, their development increases, so they simply hatch earlier from their eggs. If you keep them in a laboratory environment where food is non-limiting, they eat more and they grow faster. Well, sounds like a good story, right? Bigger fish. However, that's not realistic because animals interact with their environment in nature. In a little experiment, they don't do that. So what we did is we put these sharks in mesocosms where they had to hunt for their prey. What we found actually there is that ocean acidification jeopardized their olfactory function, which is a common effect of ocean acidification. So it messes up all the senses of fishes and also invertebrates. So these sharks were not able to find their food anymore. And as a result of a higher energetic demand and loss of the ability to find this food, they actually showed much slower growth, and we ended up with smaller sharks. So if this is the future of our fisheries, that's certainly concerning. This does, however, match with modeling studies on mesopredators. Okay, so as I said, experiments in tanks might not be realistic. So we also need to look for natural analogs where we can study the effects of these stressors in nature. And one of these possibilities is at natural CO2 vents, where CO2 is released, usually around the volcanoes, typically at concentrations that are forecast for the end of the century. What we observed there is regime shifts, where kelp forests disappeared and were largely overtaken by turf algae, with less structure, less diversity. And we saw the same for seagrass beds, which disappeared, were taken over by macroalgae and microorganisms. Much less structural complexity and less diversity. What we did see, however, is that some species actually benefit from climate change. Typically those at the bottom of the food web microorganisms do well, but in terms of fishes, the little, let's say, the cockroaches of the ocean, gobies, triple fins, and so on, they did extremely well. Interestingly, it's only the common species that became more common, and the less common species disappeared or became even less common. So we clearly saw a big impact on diversity, and at higher trophic levels, our predators disappeared, as you see in this graph here, from some predators to no predators at two different vents. So again, supporting our hypothesis of potential food web collapse. And those are the species we depend on, again, for fisheries. So it's not only the habitats that change, that support a wide range of species. It's not only the species themselves that are affected in their behavior and their physiology through to climate change, but it's also the process of population replenishment that's jeopardized. More than 90% of marine species have a pelagic larval stage. Larvae go out in the ocean, and after a few weeks they come back to replenish populations. If this process is jeopardized, you can imagine that stocks can collapse. So we did a whole range of experiments on, let's say, behavior of larvae, barramundi, mulloway, other species that are found here. And we found that also this process is jeopardized. Okay, rather than going through all the different, whoa, let me get my arrow right here. Yeah, that's good. I just need to, how do I get this one? I need to get to this video. Yeah, go through all the graphs. I'm just going to show you a video which summarizes all of this.
You are a fish.
Yeah.
You're a baby barramundi. You're happily drifting along the Great Barrier Reef coastline, pushed by the currents. You grow fast, and when you're about 2 weeks old, your instincts are telling you that it's time to move to the place where grown-up fish live. It's time to go to the mangroves. But how to get there? You're far from any estuary, all around you is blue water and you don't have a map. Thankfully, mangrove estuaries are noisy places, full of loud snapping shrimps that you can hear in the distance and follow as your guide. But there is a problem. Far away from you, humans are burning fossil fuels like crazy. About a third of the carbon that humans are releasing in the atmosphere is dissolving in the ocean and changing its chemistry in a process called ocean acidification. During my PhD, I discovered that levels of ocean acidification, like those expected by the end of the century, can cause big problems to our marine friends. I discovered that baby barramundi can become disoriented, and instead of being attracted by the sound of the mangrove, as they should, they become deterred by that sound. Now imagine being that baby barramundi at the end of the century. All around you is blue. You can still hear the sound of the mangrove in the distance. But now ocean acidification is interfering with the functioning of your brain, and your instincts are telling you to go in the wrong direction. You are literally a fish lost at sea. You have little chances of survival, and you will probably never reach dinner plate size. Now imagine to be a fisherman by the end of this century. How are you going to make a living and feed your family if there won't be any fish around to catch anymore? Do you want to know why the life of a baby barramundi matters for the whole Great Barrier Reef region? Well, first, plenty of fish species that live on the Great Barrier Reef use sound to find the reef, just like barramundi uses it to find the mangrove. We already know that coral reef fish are highly sensitive to ocean acidification, so it is likely that their orientation capabilities will be affected in a similar fashion. Second, barramundi as a predator plays an important role in coastal ecosystems, and its disappearance might indirectly affect the Great Barrier Reef by altering the coastal ecosystem functions and water quality. The good news is, it's not too late, and we can stop ocean acidification before it becomes too dangerous. All we need to do is to reduce carbon emissions, and each one of you can help.
All right. So this was made for barramundi, but the same mechanisms apply to local species, for example, Melloway. So in summary, what can we do aside from reducing our CO2 emissions? It's usually multiple stressors that have a synergistic effect on ecosystems. So whereas we cannot do much about global change in the short term, what we can do is reduce our local stressors, and those are typically eutrophication, habitat destruction, and overfishing. Especially overfishing is very important because if you keep overfishing the oceans, you also, let's say, fish out fishes that are potentially have a genotype that's potentially resilient to climate change, and those individuals could pass on those resilient genes to future generations. Overfishing reduces the chances of actually having these resilient individuals passing on their genes. So definitely there are opportunities at local scales for, let's say, making our systems more resilient to climate change, which operates over much longer and broader timescales. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Ivan. Time for a couple of quick questions again, please. Okay, I'm going to kick it off again. Oh, no, I'm not.
Just in terms of what we can do, has there been much research done into carbon sequestration in terms of seagrasses or oysters?
Yeah, that's becoming a really hot topic now, especially in mangroves. The degree of carbon sequestration seems to be quite high in terms of global ecosystems, and in various cases they actually have a higher level of sequestration than many terrestrial like forests and stuff like that. People are getting into seagrasses as well, and there are also now local scale projects especially in developing countries where let's say, subsidies are provided to local communities for actually maintaining mangroves rather than cutting them down. And in such way you get grassroots initiatives that help restore mangroves, but also help uptake of CO2. So yeah, good question, very relevant.
One more. Okay, my question. The process behind Port Jackson shark not being able to catch its fish, what is it that interacts with its olfactory ability to catch or to find fish?
Well, high CO2 has been shown to interfere with brain functioning, and because all of the senses go through neurotransmitters in the brain, CO2 actually jeopardizes any type of sensing in a big majority of fishes and invertebrates. That seem to be the key driving mechanisms. So they can't see, they can't hear, they can't smell as well in a future world as in let's say, in a present day world. So it's quite amazing what high CO2 can do with these animals in the short term. Yeah, it's like they're drunk. They act completely yeah. Yeah, maybe tonight you guys will feel the effects of ocean acidification, or after a few beers. That's how those poor fishes probably feel. Yeah.